When I was growing up, my family enjoyed playing the board game Monopoly. At the time, we had no idea that the game on which this was based was invented in 1903 to teach people about the dangers of unrestricted greed and monopoly power. In fact, even by 1903, the dangers of monopoly power were well known, at least to politicians. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890 in the first major attempt, in the U.S. anyway, to curb monopoly power, but anti-monopoly laws go back centuries. In England, laws and practices prohibiting monopolies go back to at least the 11th century. King Edward the Confessor had the power to take land and goods from anyone who was trying to corner the market on a particular commodity. The 5th century Byzantine Emperor Zeno rescinded all monopolistic charters and enacted a law that would banish and confiscate all the goods and lands from anyone who engaged in a variety of monopolistic practices, including what today we would call trusts. Today, however, new monopolies flourish despite copious laws designed to stop them. How do they do it? Well, we're going to talk about how they get away with it and what we can do about it in this episode of Progressive Solutions. As always, a brief reminder before we get into it that I want to hear from you. Does anything about this video strike a chord with you? Or do you think it's complete rubbish? What would you do about monopolies? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, hit that thumbs up button. Want to see more? Click subscribe. And ring the bell if you want to be notified as future videos come out. Also, the complete set is linked in the description below. And now, back to our topic. Anti-monopoly laws are encoded in Title 15 of the United States Code. Section 1, basically the Sherman Act, is quite explicit. Every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is declared to be illegal. Section 2, first created as the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, continues, every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize, or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony. Corporations can be fined up to $100 million. People can be fined $1 million and imprisoned for up to 10 years for each violation of either section of this law. All of that is very interesting, but it doesn't explain why these very general laws aren't generally enforced. Let's just say that there are a lot of lawyers, and economists too, and more about that later, who are very good at explaining why a practice doesn't really restrain trade, even though it obviously does. But the important thing is the reason anti-monopoly laws were written, and this can be found in Section 13. This section basically says that companies can't charge different customers different prices for the same thing, but there are two exceptions. The first exception is if it costs you different amounts of money to bring that thing to market in different places. For example, it's a lot cheaper to sell your widget right out of the factory than it is to transport it 1,000 miles to a store. Those delivery costs need to be recouped. The other exception is the fascinating one. You can get away with charging less by showing that the lower price was made in good faith to meet an equally low price of a competitor. In other words, competition lowers prices. And if competition lowers prices, then it stands to reason that monopolies get to raise prices, and that's why anti-monopoly laws exist, to keep prices as low as possible. That's the conventional wisdom, but surprisingly, economic history doesn't support it. Inflation rates in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were basically zero, and this was the time of the robber barons and corporate trusts. Even today, after 40 years of increasing monopoly powers, inflation is very tame. And the fact that monopolies historically have not created inflation has given right-wing economists plenty of ammunition to attack anti-monopoly laws. A few economists whose pro-monopoly views have helped shape American economic policy over the last 40 years include David Henderson was a senior economist on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. He's written a lot claiming that the robber barons actually broke up monopolies rather than creating them. Larry Summers was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury under President Clinton and Director of the National Economic Council under President Obama. Summers was a key figure in eliminating Glass-Steagall in 1999, a move that led directly to the housing bubble and the Great Recession. Summers' advice to California Governor Gray Davis on the energy crisis there, blaming overregulation of companies like Enron, led directly to Davis's recall. Oops, and just made things worse. During his time in the Clinton administration, Summers also argued against the U.S. taking a leading position in combating climate change, and he pushed South Korea to raise interest rates in the middle of a recession, and a lot more. Summers has been a tremendous fan of privatization combined with deregulation, and he has had the ear of multiple presidents. Finally, Milton Friedman is probably the single most influential U.S. economist of the last 65 years. His early work was brilliant. He explained why one-time stimulus attempts don't change spending habits, while permanent changes to tax laws do. He also pushed the monetary theory that the Fed has followed mostly since the late 1970s. His concepts helped not only to bring down inflation, but also to keep it down for decades. His 1967 paper theorizing a natural unemployment rate predicted the stagflation of the 1970s, and he won a Nobel Prize in 1976 for that work. He also called for a negative income tax to provide an economic floor for all Americans. The earned income credit is loosely based on that concept. But Friedman was also the driving force behind the notion that monopolies and the mergers that created so many of them in the 1980s and 90s were a good thing because they would actually lower prices. These influential economists and more combined to influence U.S. government leaders to allow more and more mergers and acquisitions and allow more and more monopolies and near monopolies over the last 40 years. President Reagan pushed and popularized the notion of privatization. Both Bushes followed his lead. President Clinton never met a merger he didn't like. And yet, inflation is under control. So how do monopolies make lots of money if not by raising prices? Well, your profits can come either from raising prices or cutting costs. And monopolies can cut costs like nobody's business. No pun intended. If you buy 3 24-ounce bottles of laundry detergent, somebody has to make those 3 bottles. Somebody has to put the detergent in those 3 bottles, and somebody has to package 3 bottles for shipping. But if you buy one 72-ounce bottle, you can get it for less because the cost to manufacture, ship, and sell that bottle is a lot lower. This and other so-called economies of scale are one reason why one large company can charge less than several smaller companies. That company only needs one CEO, one marketing department, and one set of TV ads, one HR department, one board of directors, and so forth. These departments might be larger at a larger company, but if you combine 3 companies into one, you can lay off a lot of people in each department and still get all the work done at lower cost. In addition, a large company can demand lower prices from suppliers. Walmart, for example, pays far less for groceries or clothes than some local clothing store or grocery store because they can buy in bulk. Essentially, they're getting the giant economy size. By cutting costs, larger companies can afford to cut prices, and that keeps smaller companies out. But another way monopolies cut costs is by cutting salaries and wages. Since President Reagan took office, the minimum wage has fallen 28% behind inflation, and from 1984 to 2011, real median household income was almost unchanged. And that's using a measure of inflation that's known to have some serious flaws, particularly in dealing with the high inflation items like housing, education, and medical care. It's very possible that wages and salaries have fallen even farther. And median income didn't change despite the fact that productivity, the amount of stuff a worker can produce in, say, a year, well, that productivity has more than doubled between 1981 and 2015. But the fruits of that labor didn't go to the workers. They went to the monopolists. And that's the real problem with monopolies. What good are low prices if people can't even afford to pay them? In other words, what happens when Walmart or Amazon employees can't afford to shop at Walmart or order on Amazon? And that's what we have now. This is the result of 40 years of increasing monopolization. Stagnant wages make even low inflation increasingly unaffordable. Any solution is going to have to involve a major rewrite of anti-monopoly laws. Current laws are so stymied by decades of court rulings, those lawyers I talked about, that they're basically ineffective. In order to break up monopolies, we have to have new laws that consider them to be actual monopolies. This won't be easy, and it's just a first step. But we should also keep laws that use higher prices as one measure of a monopolistic practice, and that's because we need to raise wages. Suppose that one company wants to buy another one, or 2 companies want to merge. In that case, wages and salaries, at least at the bottom, should be required to be raised. This would put a damper on mergers and acquisitions because they wouldn't be nearly as profitable. And when they do happen, the workers at the bottom won't be hurt. Another change would be to prohibit suppliers from charging different prices to their customers. Walmart shouldn't be able to pay less for its groceries than your local grocery store. We also need to put an end to what's called vertical integration, where companies buy their own suppliers and distributors or create their own supply chains. McDonald's shouldn't be allowed to own cattle farms. Would all this have an inflationary result? Maybe a little bit at first, but it would be more than offset by rising wages, and not only for the monopolies, but also for the distributors and suppliers that would no longer have to keep wages down in order to supply the monopolists. And if monopolies do raise prices significantly, we can break them up. Will all of this work? Maybe. Possibly not. It's quite possible that 40 years of case law will stymie even new efforts to stop monopoly power, but we have to do something because we've got to end the cycle of stagnant wages. At the very least, raising wages and making changes that help smaller businesses compete will create opportunities for a lot more people, and that by itself will be a good thing. What other changes can we make, and how else can we increase competition? Let me know your ideas in the comments below. I can't wait to hear from you. And if you have any ideas for future videos, let me know. Thanks for watching. Stay progressive.